Sidney George Riley. When you hear his name, he doesn't seem that significant, but this man is extremely mysterious. Even this name we're telling you, Sidney George Riley, isn't even his real name. We don't truly know his real name, but people believe that his name is Sigmund Rosenblum, a Ukrainian Jewish man that was born in the Russian Empire. But to keep things simple, we're gonna use his Sidney name. This is the life story of the best spy in history. If we say the most professional, the best spy, we're pretty much lying. Because truly the best spy is not known all over the world, because they're a damn spy. But to keep things more interesting, we're gonna say this is the best spy, at least the one we know of. There's not a lot of information about Sidney's childhood, but we know that he was born in Odessa, Ukraine, part of the Russian Empire. After graduating from high school, it is known that Sidney goes to Austria, which is part of Austria-Hungary, to study chemistry. And after he gets his bachelor's degree, he moves to Brazil. In Brazil, he's introduced to a British officer, but we're not truly sure what takes place in this meeting, that Sidney Riley enters the secret police of the British Empire, which is also known as SIS, or the modern name MI6. After joining this agency, he goes back to Europe, but we're not sure why he goes back. Did they give him a mission? But he decides to go back either way. But the things that has been written about Sidney Riley's early life is that he's a professional liar. Anything he says is probably a lie, but he lies so damn well you believe anything he says. One time he would say he's a pimp, then he would turn around and tell the next guy that he's a trained engineer. And the lies continued, and they were so professionally told that everyone would believe it. When we get to the year 1899, Sidney finds himself in London, and it's this year that he has a relationship with a priest's wife, a woman named Margaret Callahan Thomas. Her husband was a rich priest, and we're not sure because after this relationship between Sidney Riley, this man that was relatively healthy falls and dies. The doctor that examines this priest's body looked an awful like Sidney Riley, but he had different hair. And this doctor says that influenza was the cause of this priest's death. This doctor's name was T.W. Andrew, and when you look at the British system at that time, there is no doctor with this name, which is why a lot of people say this was a fake alias used by Sidney Riley to kill this rich priest, get all his money, and marry his wife, which is exactly what he did. 800,000 pounds of this woman's money goes into Riley's hands, and he could spend it freely. Another thing Sidney Riley got was a British citizenship, because now he has a British wife. And this is when Sidney gets his name. Sidney Riley is his fake British name. So now he's a British citizen, he has a very rich wife, and he also works for the secret intelligence service of the British Empire. At this time, Sidney Riley is only 25 years old, but the people that know him say this guy was built to be a spy. He's very mysterious, and you truly don't understand how he feels. And another thing is that he was really a scientist and a chemist. But alongside all that, he was an extremely talented liar. Basically, the SIS gives him a mission to start spying in his own profession, basically trying to find himself in different laboratories around the world, especially in Europe at that time, to see what that laboratory is working on. At this time, Europe has a lot of tension between countries, and it's very important to know what the scientists of those countries are working on. Are they working on chemical weapons, or other forms of weapons that require chemistry? In this case, Sidney Riley could help the British a lot. Another insane talent Sidney had was the amount of languages he spoke with perfect accents. He spoke English, Russian, Polish, German, and French with no problem, and he would speak in a way where the other person wouldn't realize that this guy is a foreigner. And of course, since he was part of the SIS, he would have the passport of all these countries. With the fake credentials the SIS gave him, he would go into these different laboratories, universities, to see what these scientists are working on and what inventions they're coming up with. And anything interesting, he would report back to MI6. The main problem with the British was Russia, so that's why Sidney's main focus became spying on Russia. he gets contacted by a Japanese general. After talking back and forth, this general offers Sidney a job in Kempeitai, which is the secret police or the secret service of the Japanese Empire. Even though Sidney's working in the SIS or the Secret Intelligence Service of the British, he accepts a job in the Kempeitai and basically becomes a double agent spying on the Russian for these two countries. In a way, he was basically betraying everyone. He was technically Russian, he was betraying the Russian. He was technically spying for the SIS, he was betraying them for being a double agent. Basically, all he was interested in was money from these very powerful empires. What the Japanese wanted from Sidney was to give money and weapon to the revolutionary of the Russian Empire. And who was the most powerful revolutionary? The Bolsheviks. But you have to know, while all this is happening, Sidney is still working for the SIS. But either way, both of these empires, like the British and the Japanese, wanted to damage the Russian Empire. While Sidney is doing his job, he gets a lot of information on the White Army, basically the army that fights for the Tsars or the Russian Empire. But this information didn't come easy. He knew that the Japanese would pay good money for this, and he would ask for the money before he gave the information. Another great amount of money Sidney got from the British government was telling them where the Russian oil wells are in the Caucasus. So basically, Sidney is not loyal to any country, he just cares about money. And if a country comes along that offers more money, they will get the service too. The oil in Iran was discovered in 1901, and William Knox Darcy was the man that came to Iran to make a deal with the Persian king, only for 20,000 pounds, or 2.7 million pounds in today's money, something ridiculously low. But where did William Knox Darcy get this intelligence from? In history, it is written that Sidney Riley was the man responsible for giving William Darcy the information that Iran has this great amount of oil. And he decided to tell the British because if he didn't, the French would be there and collect all that oil. But let's move along. When we get to the year 1909, Russia is getting worse and worse, and the government is getting more unstable as we speak. Alongside this, the German Empire is getting stronger. That's when the British tell Sidney to leave Russia alone and go to Germany because we need your services there. They give him a fake German passport and make his name Karl Hahn, and since he spoke perfect German, nobody even questioned that he's not a German. He very easily enters Frankfurt, and he gets a job in the industrial company called Krupp. And with the fake credential he got from the British, he gets a job as a welder. Sidney started welding in this factory, but his focus was elsewhere. Anyone he found that worked there, he questioned them on how everything works, or what are you guys up to basically get all types of information from them. His main focus was to get the entire blueprint of the Krupp factory and also to find the future plans of what they want to build and what they want to do. Because you have to know, Krupp factory is an extremely important factory at this time for the German army. All the weapons for the military are built here. So it's very important that the British know what is happening in here. Basically, Sidney gets the information they need and gets out of there. And as you know, the tensions were so high that 5 years after this, World War I begins. When World War I begins in the year 1914, Sidney turns into a very important agent, not only for the British, but also for the Japanese. This is when the British decide to send Riley to New York City. Why is that? Because at this time, the United States has a very good relationship with the German Empire, and they basically want to sabotage this relationship one way or another. When he gets to New York, he starts becoming a triple agent, and he spies for the German Empire as well. He gives the German information against the British. Just like we said, he wasn't loyal to any government. He just wanted the money. Of course, years pass and you get to the year 1917. World War I is about to end, and the United States is just about to enter it. And at the same time, the Bolshevik Revolution is happening in Russia. So that's why the British sent Riley back to Russia to see what is happening there, because his mission over there was much more important than anywhere else. They first send him to Murmansk in Russia. His plan was to keep tabs on the Bolsheviks to see what is happening. Sidney Riley was such a badass in this situation that he truly shows himself as a radical Bolshevik and makes himself a fellow comrade. He was so good at acting that they even made him a Cheka agent. Cheka is basically the secret police of the Bolshevik Revolution, which later on became KGB. After a few months, Sidney comes back to the British and tells them that it's extremely brutal out here and these Bolsheviks show no mercy. It's basically better to support the Romanov family and bring them back so the Bolsheviks do not succeed in this revolution. And that's basically why his entire plan changes. He was the one trying to sabotage the Red Army, the Bolsheviks, and the Communists to bring the Romanov family one way or another. Sidney was not a fan of the Communists. He was even planning on assassinating Trotsky and Lenin himself. And since he was part of Cheka, it was possible. But these communist revolutionaries weren't that stupid. They knew they had a lot of enemies, so they wouldn't be in public for too long or make it too obvious so an assassination could take place like this. After this didn't happen, he basically convinced the Bolsheviks to re-attack Germany and take back what you've lost. By doing this, the Red Army could basically get busy with the German Empire, and the White Army, or basically the army that fights for the Tsar, could come and take back Moscow. But just like we said, these communist or Bolshevik leaders weren't that stupid and they weren't born yesterday. They knew that World War I was a lost cause for the Russians, and it's better to stay in Moscow and fight the White Army so they can succeed in this revolution. They knew if they go and fight in Europe, they've basically lost the revolution and they're not gonna get Moscow back. So Sidney's plan failed again. This is when Sidney Riley decides to have a meeting with a Russian general called Boris Savinkov. Since Boris basically had a few thousand men under his belt, Sidney Riley partnered up with them so he can use this man, bring more supporters along to fight the Red Army. After doing this, Sidney went to the Latvians. Latvians had a lot of power during the Bolshevik Revolution because they were the military controlling the Kremlin when Lenin was in there. So if you had the Latvians on your side, you could get close to the communist leaders a lot sooner. So you might say, where's the Romanov family? They are in Serbia, basically kept hostages by other Bolsheviks. Sidney Riley basically gets into the Latvians' head and he starts talking to a man named Eduard Berzin. But Berzin was a huge communist and he was acting for Sidney, making him think like he's on his side and he hates the Bolsheviks, but that was not the case. This is when Berzin tells the Cheka leader what is happening and how his agent, called Sidney Riley, is working against the Bolsheviks. Since this leader couldn't get to Sidney Riley because he didn't know where he was, he told him to stand down and not make it too obvious. Work with him and see what he's planning. And that's when Cheka was basically looking into Riley. When you get to the year 1918, this is when the Bolsheviks attack the British embassy in Moscow. After this happens, this is when Riley decides to kill the Cheka leader. His name was Moisey Oritsky. But Riley wasn't the one to try to do this. One of the anti-revolutionaries did this. This assassination took place in St. Petersburg, which was called Petrograd at this time, and later on turned into Leningrad. After this assassination took place, the Bolsheviks took a huge hit because one of the higher-ups was killed. And you might not believe it, only a few hours later, another anti-revolutionary decided to take out Lenin. Lenin gets out of a car and a woman pulls out a gun and shoots him in the lung and the neck. And the person that attempted this assassination was a woman named Funian Kaplan, and she was immediately killed after this attempt. Nobody thought that Lenin would survive this assassination attempt, but they still take him to the hospital just in case. Lenin was extremely lucky, because the bullet that passed through his neck missed the artery by millimeters, and the one that went in the lung was taken out with surgery. So Lenin survived this assassination attempt. You might say the Cheka leader told to look at Sidney Riley up close. What the hell happened? Two of their most important people got almost killed. You could say they basically underestimated Sidney Riley. He didn't tell everyone everything. He basically never trusted anyone but himself. Hell, half the time he didn't even trust himself. And that's why stuff like this could have been done. It didn't take very long for Sidney Riley, the SIS, and other organizations to lose hope because Lenin survived and he got even stronger. And worse than that, the Bolsheviks got even more radical. This is when the Red Terror begins. During the Red Terror, if you were an absolute communist or a Bolshevik, there was a high chance you might have gotten killed. So it was better to lay low, look down, don't look anyone in the eyes, and don't complain whatsoever, and you'll be fine. But 1 ounce of complaint would get you killed. And this is exactly when Sidney Riley knew he was defeated. There was no going back now. And of course, it is the same time where the Romanov family is assassinated in their own home in Siberia, or basically called an execution. And that's why he basically escaped the country. He knew there's no place for him here, and there's a high chance he'll get killed. He escapes to Helsinki in Finland, then Stockholm, and makes his way to London. After getting back to England, MI6 gives him new missions, but not in the USSR anymore, in France and Germany. For the next 7 years, Sidney spends his time in these 2 countries. He gets a lot of information and turns them into the British. But there was nothing special and interesting that we need to tell you guys. Finally, we get to the year 1925. We're not sure what happens this year. Maybe they tell him, but Sidney Riley decides to go to the USSR and start spying over there and see what is happening. But this time, this is not Bolshevik Revolution Soviet Union. This is during Stalin's reign. Stalin thought everybody was a spy, let alone spies, which is why when Sidney Riley finally gets to the USSR, there's information of him getting to Moscow, but a few days later, he's nowhere to be seen because there's a high chance he was caught by the Russian secret police, maybe sent to a gulag, or maybe even executed behind a building. Most likely executed because Stalin wouldn't let people like this live because there's a chance he would escape the gulag. So this is when Sidney's story ends. And he was a record holder for spying. He spied for the British, for Germany, the Japanese Empire, and he even spied for the Russian Empire against the Bolsheviks. It is insane because a human like this knew 5 languages like its mother tongue, and that's why he was very valuable for these secret organizations. It is interesting to know Ian Fleming, the writer of the James Bond series, when he wanted to write these stories, he read about 18 British spies, and Sidney Riley was one of those spies. James Bond isn't about Sidney Riley, but he was one of the spies that Ian Fleming read about to get a better idea on how a successful spy works.